The drink you're looking at is called the Bee's Knees, and it's made with half an ounce of lemon, half an ounce of honey. Actually, just mix those in advance, 1 to 1, and then use 1 ounce of that, and then 2 ounces of London dry gin. And personally, I think this drink can be dressed up a little bit with an egg white and bitters. Very nice. But the original recipe doesn't call for that, and I can't decide which one I like better. And just about everywhere on the internet, you're gonna learn that this drink was invented to cover up the taste of bathtub gin, and I thought this was gonna be an easy little episode for me to film because I knew that that was simply not true. Because Frank Meyer claims to have invented this drink in his 1936 cocktail guide, The Artistry of Mixing Drinks, and I had done this very large research project where I took some 60-odd books that were published during Prohibition and frequency plotted all the drinks that appeared in them to figure out what was the most popular drinks, and the Bee's Knees doesn't appear in a single one. So I had no reason to suspect that Frank didn't invent this drink until I ran into another, more specific rumor on the internet that sent me back to 1912, specifically April 14th.
Iceberg, right ahead!
Thank you. The RMS Titanic struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m., and amongst those who were lucky enough to find their way into lifeboats was first-class passenger Margaret Tobin Brown, otherwise known as the Unsinkable Molly Brown, who in the freezing dark that night, she threatened to kill a ship's officer who was refusing to take their barely occupied lifeboat back toward the survivors clinging to life in the water. He relented, and they did manage to take their fill of survivors. First off, Molly Brown is probably one of history's great interesting people, and not the only one who's going to be appearing in this story. More on that later. And I love how it is that she even came to be a first-class passenger to begin with. She was born to Irish immigrants in Missouri in 1867. They were not well off. By some accounts, hers, they were poverty-stricken, and she dreamed of marrying into money so that she could improve conditions for her ailing, sickened father. But she'd fallen in love with a poor mining engineer named J.J. Brown, and she wound up marrying him instead of holding out for a rich man. Now, JJ, just like Molly, he's one of these, like, American archetype type characters who can't be real but somehow is. After JJ solves this seemingly impossible cave-in problem at the Little Johnny mine, he becomes fabulously Gilded Age wealthy, and I guess Miss Molly Brown wound up marrying into money after all. Sadly, Molly and JJ, they grow apart because she wanted culture and society and to be involved in causes, and he kind of didn't. So in 1909, they separated amicably. Molly goes on to campaign for the women's vote. She runs for Senate, but winds up suspending her campaign to go to France and work with the Red Cross in World War I, where she organizes ambulances and nurses and food distribution, and was ultimately awarded the French Legion of Honor. She was a patron of the arts and a figure at the center of a lot of going on, but in 1912, she was in France, and her oldest grandchild was sick in the US, and she needed to get there, and the Titanic was the boat that was going. And if you dig around online about this drink, you may find that amongst her many achievements, she also invented the Bee's Knees in 1929 to cover up the taste of bathtub gin. And here's the thing, there's a little bit of evidence for that. There's a 1929 little blurb of an article that credits her as the inventor of the drink. Now, a casual reader might skip over the fact that this article is written from Paris and is covering what the ladies of society are drinking in their women's only bars. So while we now have Molly being credited as the drink's inventor in 1929, it is not in the US, it's in Paris, where Prohibition doesn't exist. So we can dispense with the notion that this was invented to cover up the taste of bathtub gin. However, I have seen a couple of blog posts online that assert that Molly did, in fact, invent the drink in the US to cover the taste of bathtub gin sometime before 1929, but brought it with her to Paris. But there is zero evidence for this, believe me. I've looked. It strikes me as just unsinkable Molly fans desperately clinging to the idea that the Bee's Knees be accredited to her. Molly was very rich. She didn't need to drink bathtub gin either in the US or in Paris, but I digress. So here is where I found myself at a point that I can say that the drink was invented at least by 1929, but was it actually invented by the unsinkable Molly Brown? This is now empty, so we're switching to the egg white version. Well, the thing about that is that Molly wasn't just staying in Paris when that newspaper man asked her what she was drinking. She was staying at the Paris Ritz. And you ask yourself, Greg, how could you possibly know that? And it's because I have a letter that she wrote to her business manager in the US on Paris Ritz stationery from the Ritz in 1929. And who was the head bartender in the Ritz in 1929? It was the same guy who'd been the head bartender there since 1921, Frank Meyer. And I need to talk about Frank Meyer for a minute here because he might be just as interesting, if not more so, than the Unsinkable Brown. Through the 20s, of course, Frank Meyer was bartender to all of those notables of the literary scene that loafed around in Paris: Hemingway, the Fitzgeralds, Cole Porter, everybody else. He is the unseen, unmentioned bartender that must have been lurking in the background of that great movable feast. In fact, the bar at the Ritz was then called the Little Bar and has now been renamed the Hemingway Bar for his prominence there. I feel like there's probably a lot of bars that are named after Hemingway these days. I don't know too many people other than Hemingway who are more famous for drinking publicly. But while those bright young things moved on, Frank stayed right through Nazi occupation when the Luftwaffe High Command, including Hermann Goering himself, used the Ritz as their personal residence and headquarters. Meyer is an Austrian of Jewish descent and since 1921 a Frenchman. He is not a Nazi. He's aiding the resistance from Luftwaffe headquarters in Paris from right under their noses. Like some kind of a real-life Rick Blaine, he was the guy who could get you the papers you needed to get out of Paris if you had to skedaddle. He kept his ears open while he poured champagne for Goering and took notes. He acted as a courier for both the French and German resistance. According to historian and author Tilar Mazzeo, and I apologize if I got that name wrong, he was very likely involved in the Valkyrie plot to kill Hitler. But all of that is later and not really part of the story of this drink. The Bee's Knees, the drink that Frank Meyer claimed to invent in 1936 in his Artistry of Cocktails, but which was really invented by Molly Brown in 1929, right? But first, oh, look at that. There's another drink in my hand. I felt like I needed to get another honey-type drink in here, and while there is a drink called a Gold Rush, that's really just a bee's knees that's made with whiskey instead of gin. Instead, I came up with this in kind of looking for a bee's knees old-fashioned hybrid. So you build it over a big cube, half an ounce of 3-to-1 honey mix, 2 ounces of apple brandy or Applejack, a dash of Maraschino, a dash of Angostura bitters, stir it, and garnish it with a twist of lemon peel. I recently did an episode on how to make big, clear blocks of ice like this in this drink. And in that episode, I reviewed a Claris ice maker. People at Claris saw that episode and they asked me to take a look at their new mini model, which makes 2 ice cubes instead of 4 in just about 12 hours with a single button, simple operation, and is quieter. Costs $2.99 instead of $5.49. And look, it makes great, beautiful ice. If you want to pick up one for yourself, go to craftclaris.com, and thank you to Claris for sponsoring this episode. It's delicious and I love it, and I need to get back to the actual origin of the bee's knees. But if you're like me right about now, you're wondering if the drink got its name from the expression, the bee's knees, or if the expression came about because the drink was just so darn good. Well, let me tell you, I did an incredibly deep dive into old newspapers, and I have the answer. The very first use of the phrase that I could find is in the Thursday, September 5th, 1901 edition of the Fall River Daily Globe, in a kind of blotter column they called the East End Echoes. Facts and incidents as reported and rumored in Flint Village. Apparently, a plate glass window at Holden and Hindle's store sometime around 11:15 at night was broken by George Borden of Westport, a vendor of watercress, bee's knees, clams' ankles, etc. So in its very original usage, it meant something like the bric-a-brac and maybe who cares what. And notice those clams' ankles in there as well. Aren't they fun? It very quickly seems to evolve to be used in poking fun at the kinds of strange things that people with more money than sense might order in one of their fancy rich person's restaurants. There's a lot of satirical and nonsense articles that make references to like ordering a sandwich of fried bee's knees or something like that. But here we have a real development in the evolution of the bee's knees. Joe Laurie Jr., a vaudeville performer, seems to gain some notoriety right around 1920 for performing a monologue titled The Bee's Knees. I can't find a transcript or a recording of it, but my best guess is that it was some kind of a nonsense humor stream of consciousness thing that just rambled on and everybody laughed hysterically. I thought maybe that this show was such a hit that that's the point where Bee's Knees crossed over to mean the very best, but we're not actually there yet. The very next year, Bugs Bear, a popular humorist and sports commentator of the time, used his own variation of the expression to mock a particular bum boxer with, "He was as open as a yawn, loose as cinders, couldn't spank hard enough to dust the pollen off a bee's knees, never won a battle in 15 years and always led with his nose, followed by a cross with his chin." And then for like a year or so after that, I find other sports writers picking it up and using it in a very similar fashion. And then the phrase seems to spontaneously morph, combining the intent of both the earlier ridiculous stuff, flaff, with simply awful, to sum up and mean like utterly useless, complete garbage, nobody needed this. And then almost immediately afterwards, it transforms completely again. As ever, the youth have always spoken a language that is completely alien and impenetrable to those of us of older generations, and the 20s were no different. Just like modern news and blogs and whatever we all actually read these days, they'll occasionally fluff out a piece on translating Gen Z slang. Newspaper editors in the 20s must have also found themselves with spare column inches to fill and did the same thing with flapper slang. And curiously, in every list of flapper translations that I found, bee's knees is always said to mean the absolute best. Came out of nowhere, but I have a theory as to why. I think that somewhere whoever wrote that very first translation article got told that they were the bee's knees, and knowing no better, assumed it must be a compliment. Of course, I'm the bee's knees. And with great pride, they put that into print. The very best, me. This definition takes hold seemingly overnight, and from there forward, the bee's knees is always the very best around. Slang is very localized. If you were a young flapper in the podunks with no way of knowing what the cool kids in the cities were saying, there was no YouTube, no Instagram, no TikTok, none of this, you'd read that little article and adopt that definition because you wanted to sound like a flapper. And it just spread like wildfire. I want to point out that there were members of my Patreon hanging out with me in the private Discord for my patrons that helped a lot in piecing all of that together, so thanks, guys. And just an aside, none of this show is possible without my Patreon. If hanging out in the Discord sounds cool to you, or any of the other things I've got in my Patreon, like the HTD app, please take a look and consider helping keep this show alive. I seriously cannot do it without you. It's totally, I swear to you, impossible. Thank you, patrons. Now let's get back to this drink. We left off on Frank Meyer claiming in his 1936 book to have invented the drink, and a newspaper article from 1929 claiming that Molly Brown invented it. But we're not through yet. So there's an earlier cocktail book, Cocktails de Paris, that I overlooked in my Prohibition research because I thought I just had enough Parisian representation in my data set. It was written by Georges Gabriel Thenon, apologize if I pronounced that wrong, under the pen name Rip. And it is the only other mention of this cocktail that I can find, and it was published in 1929. And get this, Rip credits the drink directly to Frank Meyer. Is it possible that Molly Brown somehow invented this drink and had it seemingly almost immediately stolen by Frank Meyer, who served it frequently enough that Georges Thenon would then make a note of it in his cocktail book that came out all within like the span of a few months? I doubt it. And actually, if we go back to that 1929 newspaper article and read it carefully, you'll notice Molly Brown isn't ever quoted as saying she invented it herself. That's the reporter saying that. So here's what I think happened. The Ritz is one of the hot spots to be in Paris, where this shining giant of the bar is slinging drinks, and the bee's knees, his own creation, is something of a hit. Molly has the drink, she learns the recipe, and she starts ordering it around town. When that reporter caught up with her and some of the other notable ladies of the day and asked what they were drinking, and she said bee's knees, he'd never heard of it. Probably just assumed that she invented it, and that was that. So what is the truth of this drink? Well, almost nothing is common knowledge about it. It wasn't invented to cover up the taste of bathtub gin made by bootleggers in the US. By my research, it was virtually unknown in the US until at least 1936, unless you happen to have spotted that 1929 article and reverse engineered the drink, or had been to the Ritz and brought it back with you. It wasn't invented by the unsinkable Molly Brown, though it is a credit to her good taste. It was invented in Paris, sometime between 1921 and 1929, while American expats who could afford to do so lived it up in glitzy society glamour, drinking the best champagne and gin cocktails, while writing books and plays and music that we still read and see and listen to today by an impeccably skilled barman who would go on to very nearly blow up Hitler. See you next time.